As of today, January 11th, 2025, the Nintendo Switch is about to turn 8 years old. There's only a couple months left until the Switch is 8 years old. That is kind of crazy to think about. But the successor to the Nintendo Switch is already on the horizon, so and it's looking like it's going to be announced very quickly, very soon. So I wanted to say something about it before that happens. I haven't really talked that much about the Switch 2, but I wanted to just go over what we know and what we're expecting, more or less. Not gonna get too technical, but I do want to go over just, what you're expecting and also what I'm expecting in terms of like games and what I'd like to see. So yeah, let's get right into it. So first off, let's talk about specs. And that starts with the processor. The Switch 2 is expected to be powered by the NVIDIA T239, which is a custom-made processor specifically for the Switch 2. So this is going to be a big difference from the current Switch, because with the Switch, Nintendo kind of went for a processor that already existed from NVIDIA, the Tegra X1, and they just kind of adapted and modified it to work to meet the specifications that Nintendo wanted in terms of power usage and battery life. The T239 isn't really a processor that NVIDIA is making for anything else. It's made specifically for the Switch 2. And that has big implications in terms of the power targets that Nintendo can have and how optimized it can be from the ground up to have the performance and battery life that Nintendo wants. So from that perspective alone, you're already expected to get a bit more out of that hardware than you would with the original Switch. Based on the theoretical power of that processor, because Nintendo had to severely cut back on that Tegra X1 for the Switch for it to meet the specifications that Nintendo wanted. But with this, it can be designed specifically for what Nintendo wants, so you get a little more performance, out of the specifications of the hardware itself. And that's a big deal. And of course, the processor itself is far, far more powerful than the current Switch. Now, specifics are kind of hard to get into, and there's some details we don't know that would have a big influence on the actual performance, but the estimation that a lot of people have been throwing around is that the processor can be up to 10 times more powerful than the Switch 1. That's across the CPU and GPU together. So that's a pretty big leap, and compared to something like the PlayStation, the estimations right now are putting it somewhere between the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 4 Pro, with a big difference also between handheld mode, which should be closer to the PlayStation 4 itself, and then putting in docked mode could bring it closer to the PlayStation 4 Pro. So you have that sort of gap there, which already exists with the current Switch, so that's important to keep in mind. But it's gonna feel maybe a little bit bigger this time around. And one thing that's also going to make a big difference here is DLSS. So this is a technology by NVIDIA which basically takes a lower resolution image and turns it into a higher resolution image by using artificial intelligence. So the way that this sort of works in essence is that this is trained, artificial intelligence is trained in the cloud. And so basically the way it works is that they take this one image at a lower resolution, and then they give the system a higher resolution version of the same image. And you do that millions of times to tell the system that, like, when you see an image that looks like this with this resolution, it would equate to this in this resolution. So it trains itself by seeing this logic millions of times, which helps the upscaling work better by, it develops that logic that how a high resolution image should look based on the lower resolution image. So it's not just stretching the pixels or anything. It's learning what images should look like based on the lower resolution, and then using its knowledge to try to replicate it at a higher resolution with the improved quality that you would expect. So this is a technology that's sort of exclusive to the Switch 2 in terms of consoles, because both the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X are powered by AMD processors, and they do have their own upscaling technology, but DLSS is generally considered much better. And so that could give the Switch 2 a big advantage in that regard and make it punch above its weight a little bit in terms of performance. So it could make games look much better than you would expect from a PlayStation 4 style system. And what's more, and that's important to remember here, you think, the PlayStation 4 is a console that was released in 2013, the PS4 Pro came out in 2016. Why is the Switch 2 so far behind in that regard? But you have to remember that a console like the PlayStation 4 is hooked up to your TV and connected to power, and it uses about, I don't know, 200 watts of power when it's plugged in. Obviously it's gonna vary by game, but that's 200 watts. That's a lot. It doesn't. I don't know. Like 200 watts is quite a lot of power to use, and you can't do that with a portable system. It's just not feasible because it has a battery and it has to last more than 10 minutes. So with the Switch 2, you're gonna expect maybe 20 watts of power usage at most, including everything that's connected to it. It's not just the processor, but the screen and the controllers and everything. So it's a lot less power being used to achieve that level of performance. So that gap in time is justified in big part by the fact that we're shrinking down this technology to a much smaller and more efficient package than what the PlayStation 4 was doing. So you have to understand that this is pretty much the best you can get, or some of the best you can get for something this small. So moving on from the processor, you have RAM, and in terms of RAM, some of the reports that we've seen indicate that the Switch 2 will have 12 gigabytes of RAM, which is 3 times more than what the current Switch has, which is 4 gigabytes. So that's a big leap forward also in terms of RAM, and it actually puts the Switch 2 above the Xbox Series S, which only has 10 gigabytes. And depending on how the operating system is optimized, there could actually be even more RAM available to the games themselves compared to the Xbox Series S, because there the system actually uses like 1.5 gigabytes of RAM, and the operating system on the Switch, the current one, is much more lightweight. So if Nintendo can keep up that philosophy for the Switch 2, that's gonna leave maybe 10.5 gigabytes of RAM available to games on the Switch 2, and that's gonna be very important for some games that require that the more RAM that a lot of them do these days. And then for storage, we're expecting 256 gigabytes of storage, which uses a technology called UFS 3.0. So this is a technology of storage technology that's used very commonly in smartphones, and it's very fast and very power efficient, almost like an SSD of sorts. Not quite as fast as a proper desktop SSD, but it's also very power efficient, and makes perfect sense for a smaller form factor like this. And this is a huge leap from the original Switch, because the original Switch came out with 32 gigabytes of storage, and on top of that it was using an older technology called eMMC, which is very, very slow by comparison. So we're looking at potentially 10 times faster storage or more, because eMMC storage is actually very, very slow. So UFS 3.0 is a huge leap forward in terms of performance, and you're also going from 32 gigabytes to 256 gigabytes. So that's, I don't know if my math's not gonna fail me here, but I think that's 8 times more. Or compared to the Switch OLED, which has 64 gigabytes of storage, that's 4 times more than that still. So it's a big upgrade all around, of course, as you'd expect after 8 years of the Switch. It's a lot better performance, and it's very exciting to see what games are going to look like, but we're going to get into that in a little bit. Moving on from the internal specs of the Switch 2, we're going to talk about the display and the design of the console. So here things are a little bit more murky, because we don't actually know for sure what specs are being used. A lot of the data that we have about the things that we expect is pulled from either leaks or shipment data that happens in Vietnam that's made public, and you can kind of draw some conclusions from there. But with the display, none of that information is actually made totally public yet. So we know that displays are being sent to Nintendo, but we don't know exactly what they are. But we have heard originally that it would be an 8-inch or 7.9-inch LCD display. So this was the original report, and it would make it somewhat closer to the original Switch, not the Switch OLED, which did have an OLED panel. But it is likely that this would be a much better LCD screen. You have to understand that, it's been 8 years, and LCD displays have evolved a lot since then. So, some of the things that made the original LCD not as good, maybe a little more washed out, and it wasn't as good at reproducing darker colors. It was a little too bright. That would all improve with this new LCD panel, and it might even support HDR. However, more recently, we've actually heard that it might be an OLED panel instead, maybe an 8.4-inch screen, which would be even bigger. And this comes because maybe there's some kind of partnership with Samsung, who doesn't make LCD displays anymore. But this is kind of still up in the air. However, we are expecting it to be a 1080p screen instead of a 720p one, so it's a nice bump in resolution. And paired with that DLSS feature that we've talked about, this could help games look that much better in the handheld mode without using as much power as they otherwise would. And then in terms of design, obviously because the screen is bigger, the console itself has to be bigger. So it's going to be taller and wider, but about the same thickness as the current Switch. So it should still be fairly manageable in your hand, but it's going to be bigger. It's based on the estimates we have right now, it's not going to be as big as, for example, the Steam Deck, which is an actual pretty big handheld. But this wouldn't be that big, but it would be closer to that than the original Switch. So that's kind of what we're expecting there in terms of the display and the design. There's a lot that's still not known right now, but those are the prevailing theories at this point, and we should find out soon enough. So then we turn to the controllers, which are obviously a big part of the Switch form factor. So here, there's going to be a lot of significant changes. So first, obviously the controllers themselves, since the console is bigger, they are also bigger to keep the same sort of uniform look that the Switch had. And the Switch 2 is going to keep that up, so the controllers are going to be slightly bigger, which should be a good thing because the Joy-Con are tiny and very, very light. So they're not really comfortable for everyone. And these ones are still going to be flat, so it's not perfect, but the increased size should help make them a little bit more comfortable for people. With that bigger size, what I would like to see is an improved analog stick. Hopefully there's space for a nicer, more durable system for the analog stick, because it has to be very compact in the current Joy-Con, and that's why it's a little more prone to the drift issues that we've heard of. Hopefully that's improved a little bit for the Switch 2. We haven't really heard much about it so far, but it would be very nice to see. But the differences that we do know are mostly in the connection system between the Joy-Con and the Switch. So in the current Switch, the way that it works is that you take the controller and you slide it into the console until it clicks in. And this system works fine, but it's not the most elegant now, and you've seen other consoles like the Lenovo Legion Go do something a little bit simpler, which uses magnets, and that's actually what Nintendo is expected to do right now. From what we know, the Switch 2 Joy-Con are going to connect magnetically to the sides of the console, so instead of sliding them in, you just approach them and they click in. And it's still not completely defined whether that system then involves a physical lock that unlocks the controller in place, kind of like it does on the current Switch, or if it relies exclusively on the magnets. I would expect there to be a physical lock, because while the magnets are useful and they make things a lot smoother, they're not very good for withstanding pressure. So if you're playing a game and you're holding onto the Joy-Con hard, it feels like you would be able to pull them apart. So hopefully there is like a physical lock that keeps things in place, because there is also a release button on the Joy-Con still, which is actually much bigger this time around. There's a much bigger release button on the back of the Joy-Con to pull it away from the system, and hopefully that does come with a new locking mechanism that makes it a little more stable. I do feel like with the current iterations of the Switch, after a while the Joy-Con feel a little bit loose on the console, and it can make the experience feel a little less premium, I guess. So hopefully they do improve that a little bit with the new model, and I would definitely like to see that. Other changes on the controllers are, because of the bigger size of the controller overall and the new rail system, they're actually making the SL and SR buttons, the ones that are on the rail of the Joy-Con, a lot bigger. This is based on some pictures that leaked out recently. You can see that those buttons are a lot bigger than they used to be. In the current Joy-Con, they're actually kind of terrible. They're tiny, and it's basically unusable unless you put on the Joy-Con strap that makes the buttons pop out a little bit more. They kind of suck. So this new model has a lot bigger buttons, and that's awesome. That's gonna make those play sessions with the split Joy-Con way more pleasant, and I'm glad Nintendo is doing that and not just, you know, letting people buy another set of Joy-Con for multiplayer, because not everyone's going to do that. So it's great to see them putting more effort into improving the experience when you do what the Switch was advertised as, which is like you take the controllers, you can pass one to someone else, and you just have multiplayer right out of the box. And you know, that's going to be a lot better now, so that can only be a good thing. Another change that we've seen in the Joy-Con that's still kind of mysterious is this button that's been labeled so far as a C button, but we've only really seen it in very low quality, low resolution images, so it's not really clear if it's supposed to be a C or if it's a logo for some kind of feature that we don't know about yet. Initially, some people reported it being a social feature of some kind, and a recent report or rumor, I should say, mentioned that there's going to be an app called Vidmeo on the Switch 2, which would be like a video sharing app for Switch 2, like to share clips of your games. Who knows, really? I mean, I wouldn't put a lot of stock into that rumor, but we also don't really know what this button is going to do, but we have seen it on the controller. We just don't really know anything about the software of the Switch 2 to really, you know, be able to say what that button is going to do. Then we have the biggest thing potentially, which leaked in a recent picture, which is what appears to be a mouse sensor, an optical sensor inside the rail of the Joy-Con. So, as you know, mice, on the computer mice, they have a little sensor underneath them with a red light usually. That's what tracks the movement of the mouse and allows you to, control the computer. And it looks like a sensor like that is going to be on the inside rail of the Switch 2 Joy-Con. So what that would mean is if you were to take this, you'd see the optical sensor here somewhere, and you would then be able to put the Joy-Con down like this, and you'd be able to use it as a mouse. And you'd use these two buttons as controllers, and you might even be able to have access to these. Obviously, this is not the ideal Joy-Con to use this for. Probably should have gone for the other side, but you can see here, if I do it this way, makes a little bit more sense. I got these buttons and I have access to the buttons on the side, which could be useful for something. If you're playing shooter games like Splatoon, that could be very useful, make controls much more accurate, or something like Call of Duty. But then it could also be useful for, say, Super Mario Maker, because the level creator in that game, it's not really ideal to use with the touchscreen where you have to use your finger. So having a mouse would make level design in a game like Mario Maker so much easier, and that would be really cool to see. So hopefully that turns out to be true. I think I would like to see that come true. I do hope that it doesn't end up hurting the people that use the regular analog stick controls, because I think that's what most people are still going to do. This mouse setup only really works if you're playing on a desk. And a Switch 2 is a home console meant to be connected to a TV or held in your hand. The tabletop mode does exist, but it's not really the main way to play, and it's definitely not the only way to play. So hopefully there can be a balance, that makes sure that players in both styles still have the same sort of experience, and one doesn't necessarily have a big advantage over the other. But also, hopefully, this means that, if this is not a comfortable mouse for you, which I would understand, like this is pretty small and a weird shape, the fact that this technology is built into the Switch itself, and the fact that any game can do this and know that users at least have the option, then that means that they can also support an actual third-party mouse. So if you have a USB mouse for your computer, you could plug it into your Switch and use it that way. Hopefully, that comes along with it. That way you can have an even more comfortable experience if you're willing to invest the money into having those accessories on top of the controllers that are included. Finally, let's talk about games. And surprisingly, we don't actually know a whole lot here. Nintendo has been very good at keeping its cards close to its chest. But so I would rather talk about my hopes for the Switch 2 games rather than what we know, because there's not a whole lot that we know, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So in terms of Nintendo games, what I would expect to see in this first year of the Switch would primarily be a 3D Mario game and a new Mario Kart. So 3D Mario, we have had only one brand new, completely new 3D Mario game in the entire Switch generation, and it came out in 2017, so that's also going to turn 8 years old later this year in October. So it's been a long time since the last main 3D Mario game, Super Mario Odyssey. We did get a big expansion for Super Mario 3D World with Bowser's Fury, but also that game was actually primarily developed, I believe, by an American branch of Nintendo development called Nintendo Software Technology. So the main development teams at Nintendo that work on Mario games, they've probably been working on their next major Mario game for a while now. Even if it's not always been at full steam, that's definitely been in the works for a good while now. So I hope we'll see it at launch or near the launch, because Nintendo really needs this big heavy hitter of a game in that initial period. And I think 3D Mario makes the most sense. You always need a game that gets people talking. And with the Switch, you got Breath of the Wild launching on day one. Obviously, it was also on the Wii U, but at that point, no one cared about the Wii U anymore. It was probably worth it for more people to just buy the Switch and with Breath of the Wild and play the game there and building up for the future than to do it on Wii U. But yeah, so it was basically, Breath of the Wild was basically the big system seller that made the Switch justify at launch. And I think, because it's only been a couple years since Zelda Tears of the Kingdom came out, I don't think we're going to see that moment in terms of Zelda on the Switch 2 just yet. But I do think a 3D Mario game would do the same thing, because these games can be masterfully created and wonderful adventures. Like Super Mario Odyssey was absolutely phenomenal. It's my personal favorite Mario game. And yeah, I think we need a new iteration of that that's just as impactful as Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild were back in 2017 to really get people excited for the Switch too. Another thing that I would really like to see Nintendo do, and that I would sort of expect within the first year of launch of the Switch 2, would be a new Mario Kart. So again, it's kind of a similar situation here. Mario Kart, the last game, Mario Kart 8, came out in 2014 on the Wii U. It got DLC, and then on the Switch it came out as Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which included the DLC and some other changes, but the base of the game was really the same thing. So it didn't probably take a lot of development effort to make that game. And then obviously, Nintendo did have Mario Kart Tour on mobile devices for a while, and that was their big focus. It's actually internally referred to as Mario Kart 9. But it's still like a lower budget project of sorts. There's not, things are not as involved there. Like the graphics are definitely not as good. There's not much of a campaign or anything that's very structured. Mario Kart Tour definitely feels more like a sort of side project. And a lot of the tracks from Mario Kart Tour were then being brought into Mario Kart 8 Deluxe via DLC throughout 2022 and 2023, I believe. And so there has definitely been work being done by the Mario Kart team for the past few years, but I do think there's definitely also been a lot of resources available to work on a new Mario Kart, and Nintendo absolutely realizes how important this game is, because Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is the best-selling game on the Switch. So it's sold, I believe, over 50 million, maybe actually 60 million. So it's sold a lot. And the reason why I think, I think Mario Kart, it's very important to have in that first year, but I think it's almost more important to have a 3D Mario, mostly because I feel like, personally, Mario Kart doesn't really sell consoles. I think everyone who buys a Switch 2 or a Switch wants to have Mario Kart, but they want the Switch 2 for other reasons. Like, what gets you talking about a Nintendo console isn't Mario Kart. What gets you, what makes the console be popular and talked about is those big experiences like 3D Mario or Zelda. And then the Mario Kart is just something that you kind of have to have once you have the console. So I think having these two games within the first year would be extremely important. Both of them, I think, would be a huge deal, and I think Mario Kart later in the year might make more sense because that might sound more consoles as gifts around Christmas time. So I think 3D Mario a little bit earlier and then Mario Kart later in the year would probably be the best approach. But yeah, those are the two major things that I would expect Nintendo to launch within the first year of the Switch 2. Obviously, there's gonna be more. And one aspect of the Switch 2 that we need to talk about is backwards compatibility, because that's something that Nintendo has confirmed. As in November, I believe, of last year, Nintendo announced that the Switch 2 would be able to play all the games, not all the games, but the games from the current Switch. Nintendo didn't really provide specific details, so I don't know if it's all the games. I don't know if there's any sort of limitation, and we also don't really know if running those games on the Switch 2 makes any difference for like performance or anything like that. There's no details about any of that. However, what we do sort of expect is that some games will be patched to specifically make use of the better hardware of the Switch 2. So if you have a game like Zelda Breath of the Wild, which is a gorgeous game, but it's obviously a little bit held back by the current Switch, you could put that on the Switch 2, and if you patch it, instead of running at 900p, it would run at maybe 4K or Quad HD, 1440p, whatever. Like, it could run at a much higher resolution, frame rate, and look a whole lot nicer than it does on the current Switch. And I do expect Nintendo will do that for a few games. I think one of them that I would probably expect near launch was Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, because that game is coming out this year. It's highly anticipated. And the Switch version that we saw in the trailer last June already looks phenomenal. Like, it's incredible how that game is running on the current Switch. So I think they would really want to make that a sort of showcase for how much better the games can look on the Switch 2. And so I do expect to see that for Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. And obviously bigger titles, like I said, Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I think are very major ones that would get that patch. Maybe Super Mario Odyssey. I don't know if that's one that would be a priority. Some games that would really benefit from that would be the Hyrule Warriors games, because they run not great on the Switch. So I think both the Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition and Age of Calamity could really use a patch that would improve the performance on the Switch too. But we don't really know exactly how Nintendo is going to approach that just yet. But we do know that this is something that is planned as a concept, and we just have to see what games do get it and what games don't. So yeah, in terms of Nintendo, those are most of my expectations for the first year. There are a lot of games that I think would make this a really cool launch, and there's definitely going to be more than what I mentioned. For my actual job, I actually wrote a list of 10 games that I think would be huge for the Switch 2, so I'm just gonna link that below. But yeah, I think 3D Mario and the new Mario Kart are definitely the biggest ones that I would like to see. And then from there, I don't know, I'll take anything that is exciting, because I think there's definitely gonna be a lot of stuff coming out that we don't know about yet, and I'm looking forward to it. But then we have the third parties, and they actually have a bit more confirmation here on some of the details, just because leaks from third parties are a little bit more common than from Nintendo. So I think a big one, which is actually not really a leak, but it's more so a legal obligation, is Call of Duty. So Microsoft in 2022 or 2021 acquired Activision Blizzard, so the developers of Call of Duty and a bunch of other games. And because this was such a huge transaction, one of the terms of that acquisition that allowed the purchase to be approved by regulators was that Microsoft would have to bring Call of Duty, which is probably the biggest property that Activision has, to competing platforms. So Microsoft signed agreements with Nintendo and a couple other companies to say, for the next 10 years, we will bring Call of Duty to your platform. So Microsoft is legally bound to release Call of Duty on Nintendo consoles. They haven't done it for the current Switch, which is probably justified by the huge difference in power between the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, and the current Switch. But once the Switch 2 is out, you can be sure that Call of Duty is going to be there in some form. And that's going to be exciting for a lot of people. I don't really care about Call of Duty, but it's still very cool to see because there was no single Call of Duty game on the Switch. And that's weird because, you know, Activision actually supported the Wii pretty heavily. Even the Wii U got a couple Call of Duty games despite being a complete failure. So that was weird how the Switch just got nothing this entire time. So that'll be cool to see. And then more recently, on a podcast called Nate the Hate, which I'll also link below because Nate is a very well-informed person about this stuff, and I think everyone should give him a listen. But Nate the Hate confirmed or revealed that Microsoft is bringing a couple more games from its lineup to the Switch 2, which includes Halo, the Master Chief Collection. So the first 3-4 Halo games. There's a lot of content in the Master Chief Collection, and those are all coming to the Nintendo Switch 2, along with Microsoft Flight Simulator, which that is very impressive actually that Microsoft is bringing that to the Switch 2. But those are two very big games that are coming to the Switch 2 as well. We don't really know when, but you know, Nate is again a very reliable source, and I absolutely believe that if he's saying this, it's happening or it's planned to happen, you know, within that first year. So I think those are very exciting announcements. Just overall, even I also don't care about Flight Simulator. Halo: The Master Chief Collection is actually a very cool game. I've played through it on PC. I don't know if I would buy it again on Switch, but it's a very cool game. Halo is like the quintessential first-person shooter, so I think that's a huge announcement to have there, and I think that's exciting overall. You know, aside from those confirmations, there's some smaller stuff like Yuka Replay, which is a sort of indie game that's been confirmed for a Nintendo platform. That's not the Switch. And you know, there's not a lot more that's official because it feels like Nintendo is actually holding an embargo on everyone that they work with. So there's not a whole lot that we know so far, but hopefully we'll hear more about it soon. If I would talk a little bit more about my hopes, I think from Nintendo, what I would really like to see would be a new Astral Chain game. I know a lot of people probably didn't play it, but this was a game made by Platinum Games with Nintendo, and it has that characteristic action of series like Bayonetta, but in a setting that's very anime-esque. It has these beautiful anime-style visuals, and the theming is a little less mature than Bayonetta, which I kind of like. I don't think games need to be as mature, let's just say, as Bayonetta is. So I really like Astral Chain. I love the visuals, I love the gameplay, and I'd love to see another game in the series. I don't think it's gonna happen in the first year, but I would love to see it. I think Grand Theft Auto 6 is something that everyone would be blown away by if that was announced for the Switch 2, but we also have no indication of that happening. Elden Ring is one that I think would actually be very probable because Nintendo and From Software have worked together a little bit. You know, Dark Souls came to the Switch, the original Dark Souls. Not the rest of the series for some reason, but I think Elden Ring would be a big moment for the Switch 2 to have that announced. And yeah, there's a lot of possibilities, and from what people have been saying, you know, Nintendo is really going after third-party developers to get more games on the Switch 2, and I'm very excited to see what that can bring, especially now that, you know, with the Switch 2 having so much more power, it's going to be a lot easier for these developers to bring their games to the platform than it is with the current Switch. And also, you know, there's this thing where, like, you know, coming off of the Wii U into the Switch era, there were a lot of developers that were obviously skeptical of the success of Nintendo's platforms because the Wii U did so poorly, and some of them tried to support the Wii U early on, and it just did not pay off at all. So they were probably skeptical of the Switch, and they just never figured it would be worth it to put the money into developing their biggest profile games for the Switch. But now we have this perfect combination of the Switch 2 is going to be way more powerful and way closer to the performance of modern consoles. But it's also coming off of one of the most successful ecosystems that Nintendo has built. You know, the Switch 2 is going to continue what the Switch did, and the Switch is Nintendo's almost best-selling console ever. So there's this great combination of factors here that I think is going to allow a lot of games to come to the Switch 2, and I think just the first year of games is going to be very exciting. I don't know exactly what's coming, but I think there's potential for some really, really cool stuff. So I'm excited for that. All right, let's wrap this up with the final and perhaps most important thing, which is the reveal and release of the Switch 2. So this is still very up in the air, but there is one thing we know, because back in May of 2024, Nintendo president Shuntaro Furukawa, he announced that Nintendo would make an announcement about the successor to the Nintendo Switch in this fiscal year. So if you don't know, fiscal year is obviously a year, but it doesn't always align with the calendar year that we follow as people. So for Nintendo, the fiscal year starts on April 1st, and it ends on March 31st. So when Nintendo announces in May 2024, that means that the fiscal year is going to end on March 31st, 2025, which as of today is less than 80 days away. So at the very most, we're 80 days away from a reveal of the Switch 2. But personally, and based on what I've been seeing online, I think January and probably within the next 2 weeks is when we're going to see the Switch 2 reveal in some capacity. Rumors have been starting to bubble up a little bit more. There's been a ton of leaks over the past few weeks. So things are, the pressure is really on Nintendo to get this thing out there before the leaks reveal everything about the Switch 2. So I think now is the time for Nintendo to announce it. And from what industry insiders, well-informed people have said, it does sound like Nintendo might be gearing up for an announcement very soon. My hope is on next week, this coming week right now. Some people have suggested January 17th. That doesn't really work very well because that's a Friday. But I would say that the next week, Tuesday or Wednesday, would be a valid day for that to happen. But before the end of the month, I'm pretty confident it would happen. And especially because in February, early February, Nintendo has their next investors meeting to go over the results of the 3 months between October and December. So that's the last opportunity that Nintendo has to communicate to investors what their plans are for the Switch 2 before the fiscal year ends. And so I think that it makes the most sense to do it before that meeting. And yeah, combined with all the rumors and little murmurs that have been happening the past week or so, I really do think that this coming week or the next one are when this is going to happen, but we're going to have to wait and see. And then for the actual release of the Switch 2, Nintendo actually didn't say anything about the release date of the console, but I do believe that it's probably going to be between April and June. There was a report earlier this week with an accessory maker called Genki. They stated that Nintendo is planning to launch this in April. There's not really any sort of confirmation on that. Like, that's the first time we've heard that. And it does seem like a very short time to release, considering, we're announcing it in January. We have 3 months until April. And, we don't know about the games that are coming, like not at launch or even further down the line. So there's a lot that we don't know that Nintendo has to communicate. And it seems like a very short time frame to do that. I think it's possible. I wouldn't discount that possibility. But I would say that between April and June is probably the safest sort of time frame to bet on for the release. No real guarantee there either way, but I think that's those 3 months, that second quarter of the year, is probably when it's gonna happen. Of course, I would personally love it to see it in April, because I've been waiting for this thing for so long. We were expecting the Switch 2 to be announced a year ago when it was reported that it wasn't happening. It wasn't launching in 2024 anymore. So it's been kind of a difficult wait for a lot of Nintendo fans, let's just say. So yeah, I think a reveal in the next couple of weeks and a launch somewhere between April and June is the most likely. Obviously, I'm going to be rooting for April, but either way, I really just want to know when it's coming at this point and what games are going to be on it, specifically from Nintendo. That's my biggest interest right now. So yeah, that's what I want to know. So yeah, that's a sort of long rundown of everything that we sort of know about the Switch 2 or what are we expecting. Some of my hopes, I'm not the most imaginative person in terms of hopes, so I don't have a lot that I'm dreaming of, but yeah, but it is a general idea of what to expect here. And yeah, I'm very excited for the Switch 2. I know I'm not the only one, a lot of people are. And yeah, I hope, I'm looking forward to talking about it more once it does get revealed and announced, then once it comes out, and we can talk about Switch 2 games all day long. But yeah, if you watched all the way through the end, thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.